or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
This is Patty Young, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the February 15th issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The Complicity That Saturates Epstein's Files by Robert Draper. Journalists and researchers will spend the next months ferreting through the Epstein files in search of further criminal conduct or a new conspiratorial wrinkle, but one truth has already emerged. In unsparing detail, the documents lay bare the once furtive activities of an unaccountable elite, largely made up of rich and powerful men from business, politics, academia, and show business. The pages tell a story of a heinous criminal given a free ride by the ruling class in which he dwelled, all because he had things to offer them: money, connections, sumptuous dinner parties, a private plane, a secluded island, and in some cases, sex. That story of impunity is all the more outrageous now in the midst of rising populist anger and ever-growing inequality. The Caligula-like antics of Jeffrey Epstein and friends occurred over 2 decades that saw the decline of America's manufacturing sector and the subprime mortgage crisis, in which millions of Americans lost their homes. If Mr. Epstein's goal was to build a wall of protection around his abuse by surrounding himself with the well-connected, he failed in the end. But both before and after, he was first prosecuted for abusing girls. His correspondence described a network of people whose high-flying lives belied the struggles of ordinary Americans, and at the center of that network was a sexual predator seemingly on top of the world. "We've heard so much about the Epstein scandal over the past several years," said Nicole Hemmer, a history professor at Vanderbilt University who writes frequently about political culture. "And yet people of elite complicity in his world. And yet, people do seem shocked by the scope of elite complicity in his world. It's a level of corruption that the public is now getting a full view of." In 2002, Mr. Epstein hosted former President Bill Clinton and the actor Kevin Spacey on a tour of Africa aboard his private jet. His talent for entertaining attracted interest from one of the world's richest men, Elon Musk, who mailed Mr. Epstein in 2012 to ask, "What day night will be the wildest party on your island?" Mr. Musk has said on social media that he had very little correspondence with Epstein and declined repeated invitations to go to his island. There was, of course, his friendship with Donald J. Trump, and his dispensed favors to and rubbed elbows with Woody Allen, Noam Chomsky, the linguist and intellectual, Kenneth W. Starr, the independent counsel in the Clinton investigation, Catherine Ruemmler, a former Obama White House counsel who on Thursday night resigned as general counsel of Goldman Sachs amid scrutiny of her ties to Mr. Epstein, Stephen K. Bannon, one of President Trump's top political allies, Deepak Chopra, the New Age guru, the film producer Barry Josephson, Lawrence H. Summers, a former president of Harvard and former Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the former Prince Andrew, Sarah Ferguson, the former Duchess of York, Crown Princess Mette Marit of Norway, and a cavalcade of financial titans. James E. Staley, who recently stepped down as the chief executive of Barclays in the wake of allegations involving his ties to Mr. Epstein, emailed Mr. Epstein in 2014 to suggest that upper caste Americans like themselves were unlikely to ever face a populist uprising like the protests taking place in Brazil at the time. Pointing to Super Bowl ads that year, Mr. Staley wrote, "It's all about hip blacks in hip cars and white women. The group that should be in the streets has been bought off by Jay-Z." The shocking nature of some of the revelations, combined with the prominence and status of those in Mr. Epstein's orbit, has done nothing to quiet the conspiracy theories that his behavior spawned and that both the right and the left have sought to weaponize for political advantage. If anything, the raft of new details has spiraled into feverish new speculation with little or no factual basis. In 2014, Mr. Epstein received an email from an associate whose name had been redacted that said in full, "Thank you for a fun night. Your littlest girl was a little naughty." In another email, Mr. Epstein instructed a recipient, whose name is also redacted, to buy several sex toys, adding, "I want you to talk as nasty, vulgar, and imaginative as you can. It will free your mind. It's like a mental sneeze." Mr. Epstein wrote to another undisclosed recipient in 2009 who was identified on Wednesday in a House hearing as Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem, a powerful Emirati businessman. "Where are you? Are you okay? I loved the torture video." Lacking context, such messages are subject to speculation about their meaning and provide fresh opportunities for those intent on drawing attention to themselves and their views. An assistant to Mr. Epstein wrote to him in 2011, "I ordered sweet young coconuts from Thailand for you, and they just arrived, just so you don't have to drink juices from old hairy things." Underscoring how even the apparently mundane can be stretched into the potentially conspiratorial, frequent references to pizza have given fresh life to the discredited 2016 Pizzagate conspiracy theory, in which prominent Democrats were said to be torturing and raping children in the basement of a Washington restaurant. That the places and characters in Pizzagate are almost entirely different from the ones appearing in the Epstein files has not stopped some from insisting that there is a connection. In an email exchange in 2018, Mr. Epstein's urologist, Dr. Harry Fish, informed him that you have refills available and that after you use them, wash your hands and let's go get pizza and grape soda. A peculiar combination used in several emails between the two men, Dr. Fish wrote. No one else can understand. Dr. Fish did not respond to an email request for comment. It was this exchange, the right-wing podcaster Tucker Carlson said on his show on Friday, that made us think, whoa, wait a second. Maybe the long-debunked conspiracy about Pizzagate wasn't actually debunked, and maybe someone should take a closer look at this. Ms. Hammer, the Vanderbilt professor, said that the shadowy nature of Mr. Epstein's life, coupled with the Trump administration's haphazard production of the documents, was bound to beef up a ton of conspiracy theories. Newly released video logs of the prison wing where Mr. Epstein was found dead, for example, suggest that a human figure not previously accounted for in the records was moving in the general direction of Mr. Epstein's cell late that evening. This has led to some internet sleuths to conclude that Mr. Epstein, whose death in federal custody in 2019 was ruled a suicide, might have been killed. Others have speculated that he might not be dead at all, given that Mr. Epstein testified in a deposition in 2017 that he had a barbed wire tattoo on his left biceps, but no such tattoo is visible in the recently released photo of his body. Representative Ro Khanna, the California Democrat who worked with Marjorie Taylor Greene, the former Republican Congresswoman from Georgia, and Representative Thomas Massie, Republican of Kentucky, to pass legislation compelling the release of the documents, dismissed the conspiracy theories. But he said in an interview, "We must ask ourselves how we have produced an elite that is so immature, reckless, and arrogant." Ms. Greene, who fell out of favor with Mr. Trump for repeatedly demanding the release of the Epstein files, said she felt some vindication about the behavior of a male governing class they exposed. "The files are giving us an inside look into a world that we all thought existed," she said, "and we were all called conspiracy theorists for saying so." While Mr. Epstein's remarkable web of connections suggests to some that he was a puppet master calling the shots for a cabal of elites, that same web offers at least some proof to the contrary. Mr. Epstein counted presidents and cabinet members as his friends, but his influence on American policy making was negligible. His chums in the media were not newspaper publishers and TV network chief executives, but those further down the food chain, including the author Michael Wolff and a New York Times financial reporter, Landon Thomas Jr., who left the paper after admitting that he had solicited money from Mr. Epstein for a personal charity. Notably absent from his coterie were any federal prosecutors, judges, or law enforcement figures who could have allowed him to escape justice. In the end, Mr. Epstein was arrested, charged with serious sex crimes, and died in prison while awaiting trial. His associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, remains incarcerated. Still, that is far from a complete reckoning, Ms. Green said. She noted that none of Mr. Epstein's male friends or associates had been imprisoned for their behavior. And now the administration is saying it's time to move on, she said. I don't hear any of the victims saying that. Navalny killed with frog toxin, officials report. 2024 death in prison. A joint statement from Europe challenges Russia's account. Alexei A. Navalny, the Russian opposition leader who died in prison 2 years ago, was most likely poisoned by a toxin found in a South American frog, 5 European countries said on Saturday in a joint statement. Samples taken from Mr. Navalny's body showed the presence of a toxic substance, apitomatine, according to the statement from Britain, France, Germany, Sweden, and the Netherlands. Apitomatine is a toxin found in poisoned dart frogs in South America. It is not found naturally in Russia, the statement said. The findings directly challenged the official account from the Russian authorities, which was that he died of natural causes. Instead, the statement said the presence of a foreign toxin shows that Russian authorities most likely killed Mr. Navalny, who was the government's most prominent political opponent when he died in a maximum security prison in the Russian Arctic in 2024. Navalny died while held in prison, meaning Russia had the means, motive, and opportunity to administer this poison to him, the joint statement said. It was also clear evidence that Russia has not ended its use of chemical weapons, disregarding international law, the statement added. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, described the poisoning as a cowardly act from a frightened leader. She said poisoning political opponents was a tactic used by V. Putin, along with invading countries and silencing journalists. Russia has long acted as a terrorist state, relying on terrorist methods, Ms. von der Leyen said on social media. This is the true face of Russia today. Aides to Mr. Navalny have said that he was close to being released in a prisoner exchange with the West when he died. They argued that by killing him, the Kremlin would have removed Mr. Navalny from consideration in the exchange negotiations. Russia and Belarus ended up releasing 16 people, including several political prisoners and the American journalist Ivan Gershkovich, in an exchange in August 2024. News reports said in 2024 that U.S. intelligence officials did not believe that the Russian president, Mr. Putin, personally ordered Mr. Navalny's death, even as they saw him as ultimately responsible because of the conditions that Mr. Navalny had to endure after his imprisonment in early 2021. The U.S. government did not immediately comment on the statement by the 5 European countries. Yulia Navalnaya, Mr. Navalny's widow, speaking to reporters on Saturday at the Munich Security Conference, described the statement as validation of the Navalny team's long-standing assertion that Mr. Putin was personally responsible for Mr. Navalny's death. I want to repeat, Vladimir Putin killed my husband. Alexei Navalny used a chemical weapon on, she said. Of course, it's not news that Vladimir Putin is a killer, but now we have yet another direct piece of proof. Russia announced Mr. Navalny's death on February 16, 2024, just as that year's Munich Security Conference was opening. Ms. Navalnya gave a dramatic speech to the conference on that day, pledging that Mr. Putin and his government would pay for what they have done to our country, to my family, and to my husband. Russia released Mr. Navalny's body to his mother after a week-long battle over custody of his remains. Last September, Ms. Navalnya said that her team had managed to transfer some biological samples from his body abroad and that 2 laboratories had found that he was poisoned, but she did not provide more details about those conclusions. She said that a photograph of her husband's prison cell showed vomit on the floor on the day he died, and that excerpts from official incident reports submitted by 5 prison officials suggested that he suffered heavy vomiting and convulsions shortly before he died. 6 months after his death, Russia's investigative committee refused to open a criminal investigation into Mr. Navalny's death and said in a report that a combination of medical factors had killed him. In a report to his family, the committee listed hypertension, chronic hepatitis, and damage to his vertebrae as contributing to his death. An increase in blood had disturbed his regular heart rhythm and overloaded his heart, the committee found. One of Mr. Navalny's former doctors described the diagnosis as implausible. In 2020, Mr. Navalny survived an attempted assassination by poisoning when he collapsed on a flight to Moscow from the Siberian city of Tomsk. After he recuperated in Berlin, the German authorities said he had been poisoned with Novichok, a Soviet-era weapon invented for military use that also was used against Sergei V. Skripal, a former Soviet spy, and his daughter in a 2018 attack in England. They survived. Mr. Navalny later released a video of himself posing as an aide to a senior Russian security official, extracting a confession from one of his would-be assassins, essentially confirming the involvement of the Russian secret services. He was told that the poison had been planted in his underwear at his hotel sometime before he boarded the plane. He flew back to Russia knowing he was likely to be arrested on his return. He was arrested as soon as he landed. He was given multiple prison sentences that would most likely have kept him locked up at least until 2031. Despite harsh conditions, including repeated stints in solitary confinement, he maintained a presence on social media, while members of his team, who were in exile, continued to publish investigations into corruption among Russia's elite. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. A mayor in exile, detained by ICE, fears deportation to Venezuela. As anti-government protests convulsed Venezuela in 2017, a handful of local mayors opposed to the autocratic government of President Nicolas Maduro were sentenced to 15 months in prison for not squelching the demonstrations. One of them, Carlos Roberto Garcia, the slender, boyish-looking mayor of Mérida, a city in the Andes of western Venezuela, fled to Colombia before migrating with his family to the United States, where he has been claiming asylum since 2022. Forced into exile, the former politician rebuilt his life, trudging through snow-covered driveways in the Cincinnati suburbs, delivering packages for Amazon to support his wife and 2 children. But last month, nearly a decade after he fled Venezuela, Mr. Garcia's life was upended once again. At a routine appointment at the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Office in Cincinnati, he was abruptly detained, sent to a county jail, and threatened with deportation. When he called me from jail, he told me, "We never imagined that we would go through everything we went through, fleeing Venezuela so I wasn't detained, seeking protection, only to be detained in this country," said his wife Maria Gabriela Duarte, 38. His family fears that Mr. Garcia, 42, will be imprisoned if the Trump administration deports him to Venezuela. Even after the United States captured Mr. Maduro on January 3rd, the country's government is still led by officials with a history of punishing political opponents. As his lawyers rush to block his deportation, Mr. Garcia has emerged as a notable example of the limbo facing thousands of Venezuelans. President Trump has escalated deportations of Venezuelans, many of whom are seeking asylum and have no criminal record, to a country that is now under U.S. oversight but still retains Mr. Maduro's security apparatus. In the United States, Mr. Trump has revoked Biden-era protections, known as temporary protected status, that shielded more than 600,000 Venezuelans from deportation, moving quickly to expel them even as the revocation is litigated in the courts. And in Venezuela, the interim government, under pressure from the United States, has begun to take steps to ease decades of political repression. Venezuelan officials have released more than 400 political prisoners, unveiled legislation to grant them amnesty, and announced the closure of a notorious prison where, according to human rights groups, many were tortured. While welcoming the early signs of change, many Venezuelans are wary about their durability. The quickly shifting landscape has many Venezuelans who face deportation confronting an urgent question: what kind of country are they being forced to return to? It remains unclear if the Venezuelan government would move to arrest Mr. Garcia if he were deported. Venezuelan government representatives did not return requests for comment. The Department of Homeland Security, which oversees ICE, said Mr. Garcia entered the country illegally in 2022 and was released into the country by the Biden administration. The agency said that Mr. Trump had brought stability to Venezuela following Mr. Maduro's removal, and that Venezuelans could now go home to a country that they love. Mark Prokush, Mr. Garcia's lawyer, filed an emergency petition in U.S. Federal District Court in Ohio, asking that ICE be ordered to release Mr. Garcia from Butler County Jail, where he has been held since January 23rd. The petition said Mr. Garcia has no criminal record in the United States, did not pose a danger to society, and has complied with all legal requirements to apply for asylum in this country. Merida, Mr. Garcia's hometown, is a mid-sized city in western Venezuela perched on a 5,000-foot-high plateau. The city is recognized for its university, Universidad de los Andes, where Mr. Garcia met his wife, studied law, and got involved in student government. In 2013, at age 30, he was elected mayor as a member of one of the country's main opposition parties. His clash with the Maduro regime came to a head in 2017 when hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans flooded the streets after the judicial branch dissolved the opposition-controlled legislature, triggering a constitutional crisis. The protests, which spread to several cities, including Merida, erupted into violence. At least 124 protesters were killed and thousands more injured, many by state security forces and pro-government armed groups, according to the United Nations. As Mr. Maduro cracked down, Venezuela's highest court ordered the arrest of Mr. Garcia and 4 other mayors opposed to the Venezuelan president. They were accused of failing to quell the protests. Mr. Garcia and his wife packed a small suitcase, were picked up by friends in an SUV, and headed to Colombia in the dark of night while evading police checkpoints. What hurt me is that we fled as if we were criminals, Ms. Duarte said. The family kept a low profile in Cucuta, a Colombian city on the border. They started a business selling inflatable playhouses, even as they hoped to return to Venezuela if the civil unrest toppled the Maduro regime. But the couple's exile in Colombia, where they had 2 children, Carlota and Carlitos, lasted years. In 2022, feeling unsafe in Colombia, the family joined a growing exodus of Venezuelans traveling north to the U.S.-Mexico border. They crossed illegally into Texas, filed an asylum application, and obtained temporary protected status in 2024, allowing Mr. Garcia to legally work and live in the United States. It was a very difficult grief for Carlos, said his sister, Yohama Garcia, who left for the United States in 2018, leaving it all behind, everything we had worked for so many years. The family made its way to the Cincinnati suburbs, where a small but tight-knit clutch of Venezuelan migrants began laying roots. In July 2024, on the day of the presidential elections in Venezuela that Mr. Maduro is widely seen to have lost and stolen, Mr. Garcia organized a symbolic poll site at a small park, drawing hundreds of Venezuelan migrants. They would, on a piece of paper, mark their vote, and they put it into a ballot box, called Andrew Bove, an Ohio resident whom Mr. Garcia befriended. Still, unlike other Venezuelan politicians in exile, Mr. Garcia kept his activism to a minimum. Mostly he organized donation drives, gathering medicine and shoes to ship to Merida. Mr. Garcia also proudly documented his new life on social media, posted about his early morning shifts delivering packages for Amazon and Walmart. He and his family had been regularly checking in at the ICE offices without any trouble as their asylum application wound its way through the courts. But on January 23rd, as the couple showed up for a check-in, Ms. Duarte grew alarmed when she saw 2 immigrants being detained. A few minutes later, ICE officers ushered Mr. Garcia into a room, handcuffed him, and whisked him away, his wife said. They didn't tell me anything. They just took him, and Ms. Duarte, who rushed out of the facility shaken and confused. Her husband was one of the thousands of undocumented immigrants, including those with pending asylum claims, who have been detained by ICE and placed in mandatory detention, a new tactic that has been challenged in courts across the country. His detention and potential deportation have led to denunciations from Venezuelan opposition officials, including Maria Corina Machado, the leader of the main opposition movement that defeated Mr. Maduro last year. Those politically persecuted by the Venezuelan regime face very serious risks within the country, her press office said in a statement that did not mention the Trump administration by name. We urge governments worldwide to carefully consider the risks involved in potential deportation in these cases of extreme vulnerability. In Ohio, Ms. Duarte said she has not brought herself to tell her children that Mr. Garcia is in detention. Instead, she told them that Mr. Garcia was in another state, trying to obtain a passport. I cry when I'm in the bathroom alone so that they are not affected by all this, she said. But at night, when we're going to bed, they cry for their father. When is Papa coming? Transfers ISIS inmates from Syria. The Military Central Command said last week that it had completed the transfer of some 5,700 Islamic State prisoners to jails in Iraq from custody in Syria. The military said last month that as many as 7,000 ISIS prisoners could ultimately be moved to Iraqi-run facilities. That would be the most of the roughly 9,000 detainees held in Syria. The transfers are a significant shift in the U.S.-backed system for detaining Islamic State fighters since the terrorist group lost the territory it held in the region in 2019. We appreciate Iraq's leadership and recognition that transferring the detainees is essential to regional security, Admin Brad Cooper, the head of Central Command, said in a statement. The transfer flights were conducted under the military's Operation Inherent Resolve, which is responsible for counterterrorism operations in the region. Iraqi officials have said the United States agreed to cover the cost of jailing the prisoners and processing their future trials. The successful execution of this orderly and secure transfer operation will help prevent an ISIS resurgence in Syria, Major General Kevin J. Lambert, the commander of the Inherent Resolve Task Force, said in a statement. The decision last month by the U.S. military to transfer these prisoners reflected growing concern about the security of detention sites in the northeastern Syria, which for years have been guarded by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. That status quo unraveled in mid-January as Syrian government troops launched a lightning offensive against Kurdish-led forces, forcing the SDF to relinquish control over much of its territory. Under a fragile ceasefire, the SDF agreed to hand over control of prisons and other infrastructure as part of a deal to integrate Kurdish-held regions into the Syrian state. However, new bouts of violence erupted around prisons holding Islamic State detainees as Kurdish forces withdrew and Syrian government forces moved in. As many as 200 detainees escaped from one of those prisons, al-Shaddadi, before most were recaptured, U.S. officials said. Despite Washington's public support for Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Shara, the transfer appeared to highlight lingering doubts in Washington about his government's ability to secure security. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Nancy Guthrie's friends long for their partner in mahjong and life. 2 days before she vanished, Nancy Guthrie was sitting at her living room mahjong table with some of her closest friends, a log burning in her fireplace. At 84, she was as competitive as ever as she squared off against younger women she had taught how to play. Before they said goodbye on the afternoon of January 30th, Ms. Guthrie checked with one of the players, Ann Burnson, making sure that they were still on to watch church at a friend's house on Sunday, February 1st. Their ritual was to gather in the friend's den and watch a recording of the Manhattan service that Ms. Guthrie's youngest child, the NBC host Savannah Guthrie, had attended earlier that morning. They even had wafers and grape juice on hand for communion. But Nancy Guthrie, always punctual, did not arrive at 11 a.m. on February 1st. Her friends texted, then called. They contacted Miss Guthrie's older daughter, Annie, who rushed to Miss Guthrie's home. It was empty. Now, 2 weeks after Miss Guthrie's disappearance, which the authorities have said they are investigating as an abduction, her friends and family say they are refusing to give up hope of finding her alive. Her toughness has always surfaced in difficult moments, like when her husband died suddenly in 1988, or when budget cuts threatened a vital public health service at the university where she worked, or even 2 days before her disappearance when she insisted on walking to the end of her gravel driveway to get the mail, even if a friend had to help. When they discuss Miss Guthrie now, friends stop themselves when they accidentally use the past tense. Nancy is, they say. Her closest friends, some speaking publicly for the first time, are trying to avoid fixating on the ominous details. They know about the blood found on her doorstep, the masked figure with a pistol caught on her doorbell camera, the discarded black gloves found by investigators scouring the desert. Still, they think of the woman who just days before she disappeared was speeding through a stack of books, celebrating her birthday with beignets and laughing at the card table. I keep thinking about every time I'd go to the kitchen door and she'd be sitting there at the counter, just how her eyes would always light up as soon as she saw me, said Ms. Burnson, who has been friends with Ms. Guthrie for 42 years. That's when you know you have a real friend. Born and raised in northern Kentucky, Ms. Guthrie attended the University of Kentucky, blazing a path as a college journalist decades before Savannah Guthrie would become a morning show fixture on NBC. Nancy Guthrie, then Nancy Long, covered fraternity and sorority life as a society editor of the student newspaper, penning a column called Social Whirl. She and her husband, Charles Guthrie, met on a blind date at a basketball game. Savannah Guthrie has said on her show, they married in 1963 and the family moved to Australia where Mr. Guthrie worked as a mining engineer. They moved to Arizona and bought a low-slung home in 1975 in the cactus-studded Catalina foothills just north of Tucson, a home Ms. Guthrie has lived in for more than 50 years. She taught Bible study classes with friends, saying she had a special ability to make the lessons applicable to everyday life. She's been a mentor and a teacher, and someone that's really quietly shaped the lives of countless people here, said Vicki Edwards, 68, who became close friends with Miss Guthrie after meeting her at one such class in 1987. It was her den where the friends watched their Sunday services. In 1988, Mr. Guthrie died of a heart attack, what Savannah Guthrie called a stark dividing line in the family's story. She was 16 at the time. Nancy Guthrie had never worked full-time outside the home, but she landed a job at a small business newspaper, the Daily Territorial, eventually parlaying it into a career at the University of Arizona, which Savannah Guthrie attended, spending college close to home. In the 1980s, Nancy Guthrie also brought her own mother and her older brother, Pierce, who had Down syndrome, into a guest house on her property. Ms. Burnson, 66, a retired teacher who has known Ms. Guthrie for more than half her life, recalls how Ms. Guthrie came to her home one night in 1996 after Ms. Burnson's husband died. Ms. Guthrie told Ms. Burnson to sit on her lap and console her. Colleagues who knew Ms. Guthrie from her time at the University of Arizona said she was a skilled communicator who never chased publicity. When funding cuts threatened to shut down a poison information center in the mid-1990s, she plunged into a campaign to gather 20,000 signatures and urge Arizona politicians to save it, according to Jacqueline Sharkey, a former colleague who organized the effort. It succeeded. Ms. Guthrie left her job at the University of Arizona in 2007 and spent several years afterward serving on an advisory committee for the journalism school. Dave Coulier, a former director of that school, said that Ms. Guthrie kept him in check. She was quick to correct me, Mr. Coulier said. She was just one of those people who you really appreciated getting to work with. For much of her time in Arizona, she embraced the outdoors, playing tennis, hiking, and joining spin classes. She enjoyed cooking for friends and eating out, and would sometimes see movies at an art house cinema. But as she aged, things became more difficult. She told one friend, Chris Federhar, that she no longer felt comfortable going to a movie theater up a flight of stairs, only half-jokingly referring to it as a fire trap. She had a pacemaker and relied on daily medication, and she began using a cane and powerful hearing aids. In recent years, she often stayed at home, where she kept the windows open in the summer, wrote in her journal on her patio, played Wordle, and read books that publishers had sent to Savannah. But she was still sharp, friends said, and rarely complained about her back pain or other problems, and she still had a buzzing social life, never missing a monthly book club meeting. On January 26th, the day before her birthday, Ms. Federer dropped off a balloon and treats on her doorstep. The next day, Ms. Burnson, who has family roots in New Orleans, set out some nice crystal, cooked shrimp and grits, and made beignets. At the Mahjong game 2 days before her disappearance, Ms. Guthrie was dressed casually on a chilly day, laughing with her friends, and as usual, playing strategically. The next evening, Ms. Guthrie had dinner and played games with her daughter Annie and her son-in-law Tommaso Chioni at their home before Mr. Chioni drove her back to her house. Hours later, her doorbell camera captured the masked man at her door. Messages Ms. Guthrie appears to have posted on the neighborhood app Nextdoor in recent years showed that she was keenly interested in the desert and wondered whether javelinas would eat her periwinkle. She wrote 4 years ago that she was interested in buying a doorbell camera and asked about the best brand. She did not indicate she was concerned for her safety. She said she just wanted to see what animals might wander by at night. Tips surge after video of suspect is released. It was an affecting plea from a face familiar to millions of American households. We are at an hour of desperation, and we need your help. The video message from Savannah Guthrie, released more than a week into the largely fruitless search for her 84-year-old mother, was a direct call to action to her audience. I'm coming on just to ask you, not just for your prayers, she said, but no matter where you are, even if you're far from Tucson, if you see anything, if you hear anything, if there's anything at all that seems strange to you, that you report to law enforcement. Report they did. The Sheriff's Department in Pima County, Arizona, has received about 21,000 calls since Ms. Guthrie's mother, Nancy, was reported missing on February 1st. More than 4,000 came in during the first 24 hours after the FBI released the first images of a masked armed suspect on Nancy Guthrie's doorstep on the night she disappeared. Callers have also inundated 88 Crime, an anonymous tip line in Pima County, with more than 1,200 calls about Ms. Guthrie, said Fabian Pacheco, who oversees the operation for the Pima County Attorney's Office. The tip line, which forwards leads to the county sheriff's department, typically receives no more than a couple of dozen tips a day. The FBI said that it had received 13,000 tips on the Guthrie case and released a description of the suspect's height, build, and backpack on Thursday evening, saying investigators hoped the information would concentrate the tips being provided by the public. The Bureau also increased its reward to $100,000 from $50,000 for information that leads to Ms. Guthrie's return or the arrest or conviction of anyone involved in her disappearance. Late Friday night, sheriff's deputies investigated a house a short drive from Nancy Guthrie's home and later towed a Range Rover from the parking lot of a Culver's restaurant. The sheriff's department did not say if any of the tips had led them to the house and car, nor whether they were connected to Ms. Guthrie's case at all. The first major break in the investigation was the release of the black and white footage from Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera that showed a person wearing a ski mask, backpack, gloves, and what appeared to be a holstered handgun at the front door of her home near Tucson shortly before she was abducted. The chilling images reinvigorated public interest, but just 2 hours after posting them to social media, the Pima County Sheriff's Department followed up with a message beseeching the public to submit only tips they could act on, not commentary. The tactic of soliciting tips from the public has led to breakthroughs. In December, it was a tip from Reddit that helped authorities find the gunman in the Brown University shooting nearly a week after he killed 2 students and a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Most law enforcement agencies have adjusted to, if not embraced, the need for dedicated personnel and technology to find patterns in the deluge of tips that a high-profile case elicits, particularly from amateur social media sleuths and true crime aficionados, said Michael Alcazar, a retired New York Police Department detective and an adjunct professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Though 911 lines need to be left open for emergencies, he said, the Pima department should not have dissuaded anyone from calling, no matter how daunting the task might be for the investigators. Somebody's going to provide information. This is how this case will be solved, he said, because whatever Pima County is doing is not working right now. The Pima County Sheriff's Department did not elaborate on the status of the investigation, and the FBI did not respond to requests for comment. Callers to the FBI's general tip line, 1-800-CALL-FBI, heard a recorded message warning of higher than normal call volumes and extended wait times. The tip line asked callers to press 1 if they have information regarding Ms. Guthrie. One caller to the FBI's line, spurred by the release of images of the suspect, said he was stymied by long wait times. The caller, Fred Talbot, a retiree in Virginia Beach, said he waited on hold for an hour, hoping to tell an investigator that they should attempt to identify the suspect's jacket, holster, and backpack and track down any retailers who might have sold them. It was common sense investigative work, Mr. Talbot said. I'm sure they've got great people working on it. But you see, I'm 77 years old. I'm retired. I'm sitting here. I see this thing. I think maybe I can help. He wrote a letter to Kash Patel, director of the FBI, and dropped it in the mail. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Inside the debacle that led to the FAA's closure of El Paso's airspace. Last spring, in the early months of Steve Feinberg's tenure as Deputy Defense Secretary, Pentagon staff members briefed him on plans to employ new high-energy laser weapons to take out drones being used by Mexican cartels to smuggle drugs across the southern U.S. border. But their use was conditioned on getting a green light from aviation safety officials. The law, the staff members at the Pentagon explained to him, required extensive coordination with the Federal Aviation Administration and the Transportation Department, which could slow the testing of the system. Transportation officials could even block the system's use if they determined that it posed risks to aviation safety. Two people with knowledge of the meeting, who spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss sensitive matters, said they recalled that Mr. Feinberg felt the Pentagon had the authority to proceed anyway. Sean Parnell, the chief Pentagon spokesman, denied their account, saying it was a total fabrication. The meeting took place at an especially sensitive time for those regulating air safety, as well as for the Pentagon. Just months earlier, an Army helicopter collided with a passenger jet near Ronald Reagan National Airport above Washington, killing 67 people and putting the military safety protocols under intense scrutiny. Now the question of whether the Pentagon and the Department of Homeland Security followed proper procedures and the law in deploying the laser weapon has become a flashpoint within the Trump administration. Working alongside military personnel, agents from Customs and Border Protection, which is part of the Homeland Security Department, used the weapon last week not far from El Paso International Airport, prompting fury inside the FAA and a brief shutdown of the airport and airspace in that region. Late Tuesday night, the FAA administrator, Brian Bedford, caught off guard that the system was being used without authorization and, concerned for public safety, believed he had little choice but to close the airspace for 10 days, according to more than a half dozen people. It was an extraordinary decision that surprised the flying public and local officials. Under pressure from the White House, Mr. Bedford rescinded the order on Wednesday, setting off a bout of finger-pointing within the administration that continued throughout last week. Administration officials told reporters that the FAA did not warn the White House or the Pentagon that it was about to severely limit flights over a city of nearly 700,000 residents. But internal government communications, reviewed by the New York Times, tell a very different story. In one email, dated February 6th, the FAA's top lawyer warned a Pentagon official that deploying the laser system without restricting flights created a grave risk of fatalities or permanent injuries to Americans traveling through that airspace. Another email, dated Tuesday, shows that the lawyer gave official notification to 14 government employees, including senior officials in the Defense Department, as well as staff members of the White House's National Security Council, of the FAA's intention to close the airspace above the Army base adjacent to El Paso because the laser technology had been used without its approval. Publicly, the administration has yet to acknowledge that a departmental standoff over those weapons led to the airspace closure. Even the rationale for deploying the laser system is in dispute. Senior administration officials described the incident as having been prompted by a drone crossing into the United States from Mexico, an explanation repeated last week by Sean Duffy, the Transportation Secretary. White House officials declined to comment on Friday and referred to a social media post from Mr. Duffy published on Wednesday that said the administration acted swiftly to address a cartel drone incursion. But that narrative was disputed by multiple people familiar with the situation, who said the Border Protection Unit ended up shooting down a party balloon rather than a drone. Military service members were present during the incident, the people said. For the better part of the last year, Mr. Duffy and FAA leaders have been locked in a war of wills with their national security counterparts over aviation safety. The aftermath of the mid-air collision at the National Airport exposed the fractious nature of the relationship between the FAA and the Defense Department, as Mr. Duffy scrambled to put safety restrictions in place and the military maneuvered to sidestep them. For much of that same time frame, the FAA and the Pentagon were also engaged in discussions over the military's plan to begin testing counter-drone lasers against cross-border threats from drug cartels. The Pentagon had insisted to the FAA that the lasers would not pose a risk to civilian aircraft, but the FAA, unconvinced, had asked for the military's data and an opportunity to conduct its own tests, according to 3 people with knowledge of those discussions. Their requests were not satisfied. In late January, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth approved a request from the Department of Homeland Security to allow Border Protection agents to use the Pentagon's new anti-drone laser technology. It was around the same time that Mark Roosevelt Dittelvison, a principal deputy assistant defense secretary specializing in homeland defense, sent an email to the FAA's chief counsel, William McKenna, informing aviation officials of the military's desire to start using the technology. We had operationalized a stationary laser system near El Paso, Mr. Dittelvison wrote, according to a January 23rd email reviewed by the Times. The Pentagon knew that the FAA was still conducting an internal review of the weapons, he added, but National Security and Homeland Security Council officials are aware of this, he added, and agree that it makes sense for the Defense Department to do what we feel is necessary. On February 6th, Mr. McKenna wrote back, detailing the FAA's concerns about the potential for death or injuries to passengers and offering to put up flight restrictions in the areas where the Defense Department proposes to deploy the lasers. Mr. McKenna declined to comment for this article. Then, in the dark mornings of February 9th, members of a CBP tactical unit who had been trained how to use the counter-drone lasers by the Army, decided to deploy one, while members of the military looked on. They aimed the laser at what they thought was a drone flying near the Army's Fort Bliss, though it turned out to be a metallic balloon. It was the first known domestic use of the weapon by federal officials outside of a controlled environment, according to 2 people with knowledge of the technology, and it was done without the FAA's approval and a possible violation of the law. At 5:16 p.m. that same day, hours after the laser system had been used, Mr. Dittelvison responded to the FAA lawyer that the Pentagon was not changing its position on its use. While I can appreciate your concerns, we feel we have met the statutory requirement to coordinate with your organization, he wrote to Mr. McKenna, copying senior Pentagon officials as well as staff members from the National Security Council. He noted that he looked forward to an upcoming meeting to discuss the lasers. Officials at the FAA were furious, according to multiple people familiar with the fallout. Agency officials asked to move up a risk mitigation meeting that had been planned for February 20th, in which the FAA had hoped to gain information that would satisfy their remaining concerns. It did not happen. It is unclear precisely when or how the FAA learned about the shot-down balloon, but at least by Tuesday afternoon, the agency's top officials were clearly aware and had made up their minds. Concerned that the system would be used again without FAA clearance, they would close the airspace above El Paso for 10 days. The significance of that length of time is still unclear. The agency notified Mr. Duffy, who was in favor of the plan, according to 3 people who were briefed on the matter. Mr. McKenna then dispatched a written notification to Mr. Dittelvison that was copied to more than a dozen counterparts at the White House and the Defense Department, according to a document reviewed by the Times. I've discussed this with the FAA administrator, Mr. McKenna wrote. Given that the Pentagon had now operationalized a high-energy laser, he wrote that he had directed the issuance of temporary flight restriction to ensure aviation safety in the area. In other words, by 6:30 p.m. Tuesday in Washington, the FAA had explicitly warned the Pentagon and the National Security Council that it would be shutting down the airspace above Fort Bliss until they could iron things out. The restriction was to begin 7 hours later. but it is unclear whether those warnings ever made their way to Mr. Hegseth, President Trump, or his senior-most staff. The interagency process has atrophied under Mr. Trump, who has dramatically shrunk the size of the National Security Council during his second term, even as the portfolio of international crises has grown. And when the FAA made its move, many in Washington were asleep. It was 10:32 p.m. on the East Coast when the FAA issued orders that all flight traffic under 18,000 feet would be banned beginning at 11:30 p.m. El Paso time. The order covered not only the airspace for Fort Bliss, but also that pertinent to El Paso International Airport and a desolate area in New Mexico west of the Army base. By Wednesday morning, Susie Wiles, Mr. Trump's chief of staff, had ordered the FAA to reopen the airspace, and the blame game has already begun. Despite the war of words, the FAA has already won at least one concession, according to two people briefed on the matter. The new lasers have been taken out of commission for the moment. On Friday, when asked about Mr. Duffy, the president said he was doing a great job. Most of Homeland Security works through shutdown. Funding for the Department of Homeland Security lapsed early Saturday morning, beginning a shutdown that was not expected to bring most of the department's work to a halt, yet could disrupt travelers, immigration enforcement, and disaster relief if it is prolonged. Department officials have said that its essential missions and functions would continue. During last fall's government shutdown, more than 90% of the department's employees were required to keep working. But department officials have warned that many employees would be working without pay, posing a financial strain as their bills come due. During previous shutdowns, for instance, the Transportation Security Administration saw a spike in resignations because they were required to report to work without being paid. Workforce shortages caused some screening delays at airports in Houston during last fall's record-long shutdown. The shutdown is the result of a partisan divide in Congress over new guardrails on federal immigration enforcement. Democrats have pushed for a range of new restrictions on immigration agents, such as mandating that officers remove masks during enforcement operations and that they obtain warrants from judges to make arrests in homes. Many of their demands have met resistance from Republicans. The shutdown will not affect the administration's deportation campaign. Todd Lyons, the acting director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, told lawmakers on Thursday that immigration enforcement would mostly be unaffected, in large part because of the billions in funding Congress approved for the agency last summer as part of its major tax bill. Still, Mr. Lyons said that a shutdown would affect personnel issues such as pay and retention. The Homeland Security Department's Inspector General, an independent watchdog, will have to stop ongoing audits and investigations, though its criminal investigations will continue. The Inspector General is currently investigating several issues that are at the heart of the dispute between Democrats and Republicans, including whether ICE properly addresses the use of force by its agents, how federal immigration officer agents work to prevent detaining or arresting American citizens, and the conditions inside detention facilities. It is unclear how long the shutdown could last. Members of Congress left Washington for a week-long recess on Thursday. Republican leaders in Congress have said that negotiations would continue and that members should be ready to return to Washington if an agreement is reached. The Department of Homeland Security is vast and includes many agencies, such as the TSA, Coast Guard, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and Customs and Border Protection. About 95% of TSA's roughly 60,000 employees are required to work through their shutdown without being paid. Han-Wen McNeil, the agency's acting administrator, told lawmakers last week. Most FEMA employees are expected to continue working without pay, and agency leaders have said that its disaster relief fund has enough money for its current and anticipated emergency response activities. Still, the fund would be strained if a catastrophic disaster were to occur during the shutdown, according to agency leaders. The Coast Guard's uniformed personnel must also keep coming to work, and most are not expected to be paid until after the shutdown is over. Vice Admiral Thomas Allen, the acting Vice Commandant of the Coast Guard, said last week that a long shutdown would erode mission readiness and hurt morale. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the February 15th issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader has been Patty Young. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times opinion page. Following that, at 3 o'clock, the New York Times Arts and Leisure, and at 4 o'clock, a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Radio Reading mails out a large print program schedule to our listeners every other. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print